The story begins on the edge of a town that had long forgotten how to expect the unexpected. Dust rose lazily from the roads. The sun baked the wooden buildings until their paint cracked and curled, and the air carried a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. For years, the townsfolk had learned to rely on routine to understand the rhythm of their quiet existence, and to respect the subtle rules that governed life in a place where survival often depended on knowing when to stay out of trouble. And then one day she rode into town alone. Her arrival was subtle, almost imperceptible. A lone figure on a horse, moving at a steady, deliberate pace, her silhouette framed against the fading light of late afternoon. At first, the people thought she might be another traveler passing through, a woman seeking shelter, or a man in disguise. But as she approached the town square, it became clear that she was neither common nor ordinary. Her horse was strong but worn, accustomed to long rides and harsh conditions. Her clothing was practical yet weathered, showing signs of many days on the trail, and her eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the town with a quiet awareness that made the few who noticed her pause. There was a moment of stillness in the town as she moved forward. Windows shuttered in curiosity, doors cracked open just enough for cautious eyes to peek through, and whispers began to thread through the streets. Who was she? Why had she come alone? What did she want? These questions hung in the air, heavier than the heat and dust, as if the town itself recognized the potential for change in her presence. The sheriff, a man with years etched into the lines of his face and a reputation for being calm under pressure, stepped into the square. He had seen travelers come and go, men and women seeking fortune, refuge, or mischief. But there was something different about her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, a composure that spoke of experience, of knowing how to read people and situations, and of being capable of defending herself in ways that few would dare to challenge. The townsfolk watched from the shadows as she dismounted with a fluid motion, tying her horse to a post without a word, without a glance at the curious faces around her. She walked into the town as if she belonged, though everyone knew she did not. The saloon doors creaked slightly as she pushed them open, and the murmuring conversations inside faltered and paused. Patrons froze mid-sentence, their eyes flicking to her and back, unsure if they should greet her or remain silent. Her presence carried a subtle authority, one that demanded acknowledgement without a single word, without a show of force. She did not sit, did not order immediately, but simply observed, taking in the room, noting exits, noting people, noting the atmosphere. Every movement was deliberate, every glance purposeful, and every person who caught her gaze felt a momentary unease, a recognition that this woman was not to be underestimated. Rumors began to spread immediately. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the town was buzzing with speculation. Some said she was a bounty hunter, tracking a fugitive through the frontier. Others whispered that she was running from something, a shadow of a past that had followed her across miles of desert and canyon. A few claimed she carried a secret so dangerous that even speaking her name aloud might invite trouble. None of it mattered, for the truth was already evident in the way she held herself, the way she moved, and the way the very air seemed to shift when she was near. The sheriff approached cautiously, though there was an understanding that she was unlikely to be an immediate threat. "Evening," he said, keeping his tone neutral, his hands visible at his sides. "What brings you to Black Hollow?" She met his gaze steadily, her eyes calm but sharp, as if weighing not just his words, but the intent behind them. "Just passing through," she said softly, her voice clear, carrying the faintest trace of authority. "But I prefer to know the town before I stay. Tell me, who runs things here?" The sheriff blinked, taken slightly aback by the directness of her question. He had grown accustomed to people respecting his authority or challenging it with guns and bravado, not with quiet, measured confidence. "Depends on what you mean," he said carefully. "We have folks who make trouble, folks who pay their dues, and folks who mind their business." She nodded once as if accepting the information, then allowed her attention to drift across the room, noting the conversations, the hidden glances, the subtle power dynamics that governed life in Black Hollow. The patrons felt her scrutiny and an uneasy silence fell. No one dared to interrupt. No one dared to make a sudden move. And the sheriff realized that her presence alone had shifted the balance in a way that could not be ignored. As night fell, she secured a room at the local inn. The innkeeper, a woman named Clara, offered a polite greeting, noticing immediately the careful way she handled her horse, the deliberate precision with which she removed her gear, and the faint air of mystery that seemed to follow her. "Dinner?" Clara asked gently, hoping to start a conversation that might reveal more about this stranger. She looked at Clara with a faint smile, almost imperceptible, and said, "Yes, but quietly. I like to observe." And so began the first evening in Black Hollow for a woman who would soon rewrite the rules of the town. She dined alone, her senses alert to every movement, every sound. The townsfolk, curious and cautious, watched her from a distance, unable to predict what she might do next, or how her presence would affect the men who had long ruled the streets with intimidation and fear. It did not take long for her to make an impression. A local troublemaker, known for pushing boundaries and asserting dominance through petty theft and intimidation, approached her at the inn. He smirked, confident in his reputation, assuming that any newcomer, especially a lone woman, could be easily intimidated or manipulated. "Evening, stranger," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, his eyes scanning her for weakness. "Not often we see someone ride in alone. You lost?" She looked up slowly, her gaze steady, and in that moment the room seemed to pause. The subtle weight of her confidence, the calm authority that radiated from her every movement, made the troublemaker hesitate. "I know exactly where I am," she replied, her tone even but carrying an edge of quiet warning. "And I suggest you consider the consequences before testing me." The troublemaker laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking or serious. A pause stretched longer than comfort allowed. Then another man in the room, a seasoned patron who had seen his share of fights and altercations, cleared his throat. I would not press her," he said quietly, glancing between the stranger and the troublemaker. "She's not like anyone who's come through here before." The first man's bravado faltered. He muttered something under his breath and backed away, though the fear in his eyes was subtle, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. By the end of the evening it was clear to anyone paying attention that this woman, riding alone into Black Hollow, commanded a presence that demanded respect. She had not drawn a weapon, had not raised her voice, and had not made a single threatening move. Yet she had altered the dynamics of the room with nothing more than her calm, calculated presence. By the next morning, the whispers had spread through the town. People who had initially doubted her abilities now reconsidered, realizing that she was not a visitor to be ignored. Something about her arrival had unsettled the established order, and the town understood instinctively that her stay, however brief, would have consequences. The sheriff, observing from his office, made a note to approach cautiously. He had seen many newcomers, had dealt with countless threats, but something about her was different. She did not rely on intimidation, she did not rely on reputation, and yet she carried a force that was undeniable. And the moment he stepped into the streets to speak with her, he felt the subtle shift in control that had already begun. "Good morning," he said, keeping his tone friendly but measured. "I hope you found your room comfortable." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried confidence and calm authority simultaneously. "Comfortable enough, but I prefer to know the people and the rhythms of the town before I decide anything else." That statement, simple as it was, carried weight. The sheriff nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words and the quiet power behind them. The town, in its dusty, sun-baked silence, began to feel the subtle impact of a newcomer whose influence was immediate, who had arrived alone but with authority, and whose presence promised to reshape the balance of power in ways no one could yet predict. Even the local outlaws, those who had long terrorized Black Hollow with little resistance, took note. They watched from the shadows, aware that someone had arrived who did not fit the expected patterns of the frontier, who did not rely on brute force or reputation, and whose actions hinted at strategy, calculation, and skill. By the time the sun reached its zenith, it was clear to anyone paying attention that Black Hollow would never be the same again. And so, the first day passed with an undercurrent of tension, curiosity, and respect. She had ridden in alone, quietly, deliberately, and in doing so, had shifted the town's perception of power. What happened next would unfold slowly, with careful precision, as the quiet stranger began to challenge assumptions, test boundaries, and reveal the full measure of her skills and influence over a town that had long relied on fear to maintain order. The morning after her arrival, Black Hollow felt a subtle tension that had never existed before. The sun climbed over the dusty rooftops, illuminating streets that were usually empty except for a few lingering townsfolk, and yet there was a quiet watchfulness in the air. Conversations were lower, movements more measured, and even the children who played near the edges of the town seemed to sense that something different had arrived. The woman who had ridden in alone had unsettled the routine of the town without raising a voice or drawing a weapon. Her presence was enough to shift perceptions, to make people reconsider who held influence, and to question the boundaries they had long taken for granted. The sheriff had spent the night observing from the shadows, noting how her influence subtly extended through the streets. He saw men who had long relied on intimidation hesitate, pause, and reconsider their actions. He watched merchants adjust their business practices, aware that the quiet stranger had a presence that could easily unravel schemes, manipulate outcomes, or expose secrets. And he understood, in a way that only someone familiar with the undercurrents of power could, that she was not here by chance. She had a purpose, and her purpose involved reshaping the town in ways that were both deliberate and precise. By mid-morning, she began to explore the town with quiet confidence. Her steps were deliberate, her gaze observant, and her awareness of her surroundings complete. She stopped at the general store, noting the goods, the layout, the interactions between employees and customers. She walked to the blacksmith, watching the rhythm of hammer against metal, noting the flow of work and the subtle hierarchies that existed among the men who labored there. At every turn, her presence commanded acknowledgement, though no one dared confront her directly. The townsfolk recognized her authority, subtle as it was, and measured their actions against it. It was not long before she encountered a group of men who had previously dominated the town through fear and brute strength. They assumed that she could be intimidated, that a woman riding alone would be vulnerable in the frontier. Their confidence was palpable, their swagger a performance meant to assert dominance. They circled her casually, words chosen to provoke, to test, to assert that they were still in control. She did not flinch. Her eyes remained calm, her posture deliberate, her movements measured. She let them speak, listened to every word, and responded only when necessary. Her response was neither threatening nor defensive. It was precise, deliberate, and carried the weight of authority. The men faltered, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. They had been tested countless times, and yet here was someone whose presence alone disrupted their confidence, whose calm demeanor challenged their assumptions about power and control. By midday, rumors of her skills and resolve had spread through the town. From the saloon to the inn, whispers told tales of a woman who moved with purpose, who carried herself with quiet confidence, and who commanded respect without overt displays of aggression. People began to notice the subtle changes in behavior among those who had once ruled through fear. The local troublemakers avoided confrontations, merchants conducted business more carefully, and even the sheriff acknowledged that her presence had altered the balance in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. She continued to observe, learning the town's rhythm and its hidden dynamics. She noted the loyalties, the alliances, the grudges, and the unspoken agreements that held Black Hollow together. Each observation informed her approach, allowing her to anticipate potential conflicts and navigate situations with the precision of someone who understood the frontier and subtle complexities. She did not need weapons or threats. Her awareness and strategic thinking were enough to influence the town, to command respect, and to establish her presence as a force to be reckoned with. Later that afternoon, a confrontation seemed inevitable. One of the town's more notorious outlaws attempted to assert himself, stepping into her path with an expectation of intimidation. He spoke loudly, gesturing broadly, assuming that his reputation and physical presence would dominate. She looked at him calmly, assessing, calculating, and responding with words that carried authority and clarity. "I suggest you reconsider your approach," she said quietly, but with an unmistakable weight behind the words. "Not because I am afraid, but because I understand the consequences of choice." The outlaw hesitated, caught off guard by the quiet confidence and deliberate precision of her voice. He had faced many threats before, many challenges, many confrontations, and yet he was unprepared for someone who did not need to fight to assert dominance. His bravado faltered, and the subtle shift in the room was palpable. Witnesses noted the change, and even the townsfolk who had observed from the edges understood that this encounter was shaping the future of Black Hollow in a way they could not yet fully articulate. By evening, she had made her way to the edge of town to secure supplies and plan her next steps. Observing from a distance, the sheriff realized that her strategy was deliberate. She moved through the town with purpose, testing reactions, assessing influence, and demonstrating control through awareness, rather than aggression. Every interaction was measured, every step intentional, and every decision reinforced her growing reputation. The town was being subtly reshaped, with power no longer held exclusively by fear, but influenced by skill, observation, and precise action. Over the following days, her presence continued to disrupt established patterns. The men who had previously dominated Black Hollow began to falter, questioning their own strategies and reconsidering their actions. Minor conflicts resolved themselves without violence. Disputes were diffused before escalating, and decisions throughout the town were tempered by the recognition of her influence. Even those who had initially doubted her skills began to understand that she operated on a level that transcended brute force. She commanded authority not by threatening or shooting, but by observing, calculating, and acting with precision. A local saloon owner recounted how she intervened subtly during a heated argument between two men over a debt. Neither party realized at first that her presence had shifted the conversation, influenced their decisions, and diffused the tension entirely. By the time anyone noticed, the conflict had ended, not with a fight, but with compliance and acknowledgement of her quiet authority. Stories like these began to spread throughout the town, further cementing her reputation and the awareness that Black Hollow was no longer predictable, no longer entirely under the control of those who had once ruled through fear. The sheriff began to see her as both an ally and a challenge. He recognized her capabilities, her awareness, and her subtle influence, yet he also understood that her presence complicated his own understanding of order and authority. He approached her one afternoon, noting her attention to detail as she observed a group of men negotiating a trade. "You have a way of seeing things others miss," he said cautiously, trying to gauge her response. She looked up, her eyes steady and clear. "Observation is essential," she replied. "Understanding people and patterns is the difference between chaos and control." The sheriff nodded slowly, realizing that she was not merely passing through. She had come with a purpose, and that purpose involved reshaping the town, challenging assumptions, and demonstrating that authority could exist without violence, that influence could be exerted through perception, patience, and precise action. He understood that Black Hollow was entering a new chapter, and her presence was at the center of it. As the days continued, she encountered more challenges from those who resisted change. Men who had once relied on fear attempted to intimidate, to provoke, and to assert dominance. Each encounter was met with measured responses, precise observation, and deliberate action that neutralized threats without open confrontation. She demonstrated that authority could exist quietly, strategically, and effectively, and that influence did not require weapons, threats, or loud words. By the end of the week, the town had begun to shift fundamentally. Merchants conducted business differently, conflicts resolved themselves more smoothly, and even the children seemed to navigate the streets with a newfound awareness of the rules that had been subtly rewritten. Black Hollow was no longer predictable, and its inhabitants had begun to understand that a single individual, acting with awareness, skill, and precision, could redefine the balance of power without firing a shot. And so, as night fell on the seventh day, The quiet woman who had ridden into town alone had already reshaped Black Hollow. Her presence was no longer a curiosity or a mystery. It was a force, a subtle, undeniable force that commanded respect, influenced outcomes, and reminded everyone that power was not always about reputation, weapons, or fear. Sometimes the quietest actions carried the greatest weight, and the town had learned that lesson in a week that would be remembered for generations. The days that followed were filled with a tension that ran beneath every interaction in Black Hollow. The townsfolk moved carefully through the streets, their eyes scanning for any sign of disruption, for any shift that might signal a challenge to the new order the lone rider had established. Conversations were hushed, gestures measured, and even the children who played near the edges of town carried a sense of awareness that had not existed before. Her influence had subtly rewritten the rules, and people adjusted instinctively, knowing that authority could no longer be assumed based on past reputation or fear. The woman, whose name was whispered quietly among the townsfolk as they debated whether she was bounty hunter, fugitive, or some other force altogether, continued to observe the town with precision. She noted patterns, behaviors, and alliances, understanding how influence moved through the people around her. Every glance, every decision, every minor interaction was a test, a way to gauge the town's reactions and assess potential threats. Her presence alone began to shape outcomes. A heated argument dissolved before it erupted. A minor theft was abandoned when she appeared unexpectedly at the edge of the scene. Without raising her voice or drawing a weapon, she began to demonstrate control that was subtle, deliberate, and unmistakable. The sheriff, who had once relied on his own reputation to maintain order, watched with cautious respect. He realized that her influence was changing the town's dynamics in ways that he could not achieve alone. Her methods were different. She did not threaten, she did not boast, she did not demand obedience. Yet people deferred to her presence, questioned their own assumptions, and reconsidered their actions. Slowly, the sheriff began to understand that her arrival had introduced a form of authority that was both more nuanced and more enduring than fear alone. By the middle of the week, her influence was undeniable. Local outlaws who had once moved freely through the town now avoided her gaze and altered their plans when she appeared nearby. Their confidence faltered, their strategies faltered, and whispers spread among them about the woman who could change outcomes without a single act of violence. She had become a legend before anyone had a chance to understand her fully. Every action she took, every place she moved through shifted the balance of power subtly but effectively. One afternoon, a confrontation seemed inevitable. A man who had long used threats and intimidation to maintain dominance in the town approached her as she moved through the square. His posture was confident, his gestures calculated, and his words chosen to provoke. "You don't belong here," he said, trying to assert authority, trying to test the limits of her patience and strength. She turned to him slowly, her gaze calm and unwavering, and spoke in a measured tone. "I belong wherever I choose to be," she said, "and I suggest you consider your actions carefully before testing me." Her words were simple, but their impact was profound. The man hesitated, uncertainty creeping into his expression. He had challenged many before and relied on fear to maintain his reputation, but here was someone whose authority required no weapons, no threats, and no displays of force. The balance in the room shifted immediately. The townsfolk observed in silence, recognizing that a single individual could disrupt the established order without raising a hand, proving that power was not always measured by brute strength. As the week progressed, more subtle challenges arose. The woman continued to navigate the town, observing, assessing, and acting strategically. She diffused disputes before they escalated, influenced decisions in ways that were imperceptible at first, and left an impression on everyone who encountered her. By acting quietly and deliberately, she reshaped the town's understanding of authority, demonstrating that skill, awareness, and timing often outweighed the traditional forms of power they had long relied upon. Even the sheriff found himself relying on her insights, consulting her about the town's dynamics and potential conflicts. He realized that her approach was not only effective but also enduring. She had introduced a new way of managing influence and power, one that required patience, observation, and careful action rather than intimidation. The town's residents, sensing this shift, adjusted their behavior accordingly. further reinforcing her authority and establishing a new equilibrium in Black Hollow. A critical turning point came when a shipment of goods intended for the most notorious outlaw in town arrived unexpectedly. The outlaw assumed he could seize the cargo and assert his dominance, but she anticipated the move. Her careful observation and strategic positioning allowed her to intervene subtly, redirecting the shipment without confrontation and ensuring that the outcome favored the town rather than the outlaw. By the time he realized what had occurred, his confidence was shaken and his control over the town diminished further. The incident became the talk of Black Hollow. People marveled at how she had managed to influence events without violence, how a single presence could alter outcomes, and how subtle strategy could achieve results that force could not. Stories of her actions spread quickly, reinforcing her growing legend and cementing her reputation as a force to be reckoned with. Her authority was no longer a question. It was a fact recognized by both the townsfolk and those who had long believed that fear ruled the frontier. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in Black Hollow had transformed. Conflicts that once erupted spontaneously were now tempered by her influence. Decisions, gestures, and conversations carried an underlying awareness of her presence. Even the most hardened criminals altered their actions, recognizing that she had the ability to shape outcomes without aggression. The town's perception of power had changed fundamentally, and her example demonstrated that authority could exist quietly, strategically, and effectively. One evening she rode to the outskirts of town to observe a group of men who were plotting to reassert control through intimidation. She approached cautiously, studying their patterns and movements. Without confrontation, she positioned herself strategically, altering the environment, influencing their decisions, and neutralizing their plan before it could begin. By the time the men realized her intervention, their schemes had unraveled entirely, leaving them frustrated, cautious, and fully aware that their former tactics would no longer suffice. The sheriff, who had accompanied her quietly on previous days, acknowledged the remarkable precision of her actions. He began to see that she did not need to rely on force because her understanding of people and situations allowed her to anticipate threats, redirect intentions, and influence outcomes subtly yet effectively. Her authority was not visible in the way traditional power often is. It was felt, recognized, and respected through observation, awareness, and deliberate action. As her stay continued, Black Hollow experienced a transformation that extended beyond immediate conflicts. Merchants conducted business with caution and foresight. Farmers adjusted their practices and alliances. Children navigated the streets with heightened awareness. Even those who had previously relied on fear to command compliance recognized that the rules had changed. Authority now depended on strategy, perception, and presence as much as reputation and physical force. The woman continued to test the town gently, challenging assumptions and encouraging the people of Black Hollow to consider the nature of influence. She intervened in disputes, redirected potential conflicts, and shaped outcomes with subtle precision. No one ever felt threatened directly, yet everyone recognized that her presence demanded acknowledgement and respect. The balance of power, once dominated by fear and aggression, had shifted toward strategic awareness and deliberate action. By midweek, the townsfolk had begun to anticipate her movements, noting her habits and observing her influence. They realized that she was not merely a visitor but a force of change, one that redefined authority and challenged old patterns of control. Even those who had once questioned her skills and intent now recognized her capability and the inevitability of her influence over the town. Her influence reached every corner of Black Hollow. A confrontation at the saloon was resolved without conflict. A theft that might have escalated into violence ended quietly. The town learned to navigate a new reality, understanding that the quietest actions could carry the most profound consequences. She had arrived alone, without support or spectacle, yet her authority was undeniable. And so, as the sun set at the end of another week, Black Hollow had begun to operate under a new understanding of power. Her influence had subtly rewritten the rules, reshaped behavior, and established a presence that demanded respect without confrontation. Fear no longer dictated actions. Awareness, strategy, and observation now guided the town. The quiet woman who rode in alone had proven that authority could exist without violence, and that the most profound impact often comes from deliberate, measured action rather than force. The days that followed solidified the woman's reputation in Black Hollow. People no longer questioned her presence, they acknowledged it. The town's rhythms had shifted, influenced by her subtle interventions, careful observations, and deliberate actions. She moved through the streets like a quiet force of nature, unseen yet profoundly felt. Even those who had once relied on fear to command compliance adapted to her style of authority, recognizing that intimidation alone could no longer dictate outcomes. The sheriff, who had watched her carefully from the beginning, now worked alongside her in a way that was unspoken but understood. He provided support when necessary, but he also recognized that her methods operated beyond conventional authority. She did not demand obedience. She inspired it through presence, skill, and insight. Conflicts were resolved before they escalated. Disputes were diffused without threats, and the town's natural rhythm was maintained, not by force, but by her careful influence. One morning, word arrived that a notorious gang from a nearby county planned to raid Black Hollow. The town had feared such an event for years, and even the sheriff felt a flicker of anxiety. He gathered his deputies and began preparations, but she walked calmly into the planning room, her eyes clear and focused. Without raising her voice or asserting dominance, she began to outline strategies that accounted for every possible scenario. Her presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. The men listened, aware that she had insight they could not ignore, and that her approach was both practical and precise. When the gang arrived, they were met not with guns drawn or threats shouted across the square, but with anticipation, careful planning, and the quiet authority of a woman who had anticipated every move. Her interventions were subtle, positioning townsfolk strategically, influencing the outlaw's perception of risk, and neutralizing threats without firing a shot. The gang was disoriented, frustrated by the seamless coordination they could not comprehend, and eventually retreated without ever fully engaging. Black Hollow's residents watched in awe. They had feared raids, violence, and chaos, yet the quiet woman had demonstrated that intelligence, observation, and presence could be more powerful than force. Her actions redefined what it meant to protect and command respect in a town that had long relied on fear. The sheriff, observing quietly, realized that he had witnessed a masterclass in influence and authority. Word of her deeds spread quickly to neighboring towns and outlying settlements. Travelers and merchants told stories of a lone rider who had arrived in Black Hollow, reshaped the town's dynamics, and neutralized threats with subtlety, precision, and strategy. Even the outlaws who had once terrorized the frontier whispered her name, uncertain whether to fear, respect, or underestimate her. Legends began to form, and her presence became a symbol of authority that did not rely on aggression but on perception, patience, and deliberate action. Over the next several weeks, she continued to move through Black Hollow with the same quiet confidence. Minor disputes were settled before escalation. Strategic decisions were influenced subtly, ensuring stability in a town that had once teetered on the edge of chaos. Even the children and newcomers sensed that her influence shaped the environment. Respect became a natural reaction rather than a forced response. Black Hollow had evolved. The sheriff observed her interactions with the townsfolk, noting that she did not make people feel small or powerless. She empowered them through subtle guidance, observation, and careful intervention. She had transformed authority into something collaborative yet undeniable. The town's social structure shifted quietly, but profoundly, with influence measured by wisdom, awareness, and precision rather than intimidation or strength. A pivotal moment occurred when a dispute arose between two merchants over the ownership of goods delivered to the town. The argument could have escalated into a fight, drawing attention and creating chaos. She intervened with a calm voice and careful questions, encouraging both parties to reflect on the implications of their actions. By the end of the conversation, the dispute had been resolved fairly, and both merchants acknowledged her role without ever feeling coerced. Her influence had guided the outcome while preserving dignity and respect. As more time passed, the townsfolk grew to rely on her presence as a stabilizing force. They adjusted their behavior not out of fear, but out of recognition that she understood patterns, relationships, and the subtleties of influence in ways they could not. Her quiet observation ensured that potential conflicts were diffused before they escalated, that alliances were balanced, and that the town could function smoothly under a new paradigm of authority. Even those who had once ruled through intimidation recognized that their methods were no longer effective. They learned to observe, to consider consequences, and to understand the nuances of control that the quiet woman had introduced. Some left the town, unwilling or unable to adapt. Others changed their approach, acknowledging that subtle influence could be as powerful, if not more so, than force. Black Hollow had evolved because of her presence, and the town would never return to its former reliance on fear alone. In time, she became more than a visitor. She became a legend in Black Hollow, a figure whose methods of leadership and influence would be remembered for generations. Travelers and settlers told stories of a woman who had arrived alone, reshaped a town, and commanded respect without violence. Her legacy was defined not by confrontation, but by foresight, perception, and subtle authority. The sheriff, reflecting on the events, understood that her lessons extended beyond immediate outcomes. She had demonstrated that true influence required awareness, patience, and careful action. She had proven that authority could be exercised without force, and that respect could be earned quietly yet decisively. Black Hollow's social fabric had been transformed, guided by her presence and shaped by her deliberate interventions. By the time she prepared to leave, the town had changed entirely. The streets moved with a new rhythm, disputes were handled with thoughtful consideration, and even the most hardened residents had learned to recognize the value of subtle authority. Her legacy remained in every action, every decision, and every cautious glance that reflected her influence. When she finally rode out of town, the townsfolk gathered quietly to watch her leave. There were no cheers, no fanfare, and no dramatic farewell. Yet her impact was undeniable. The lessons she imparted lingered in every conversation, every choice, and every behavior. Black Hollow had been reshaped by her presence, guided by her wisdom, and reminded that sometimes the quietest individual carries the greatest authority. As her silhouette disappeared into the horizon, the town understood that power was no longer defined by fear alone. Influence could exist subtly, strategically, and effectively. Authority could be exercised with patience and insight rather than aggression. And a single person riding alone could alter the destiny of an entire town simply by observing, acting, and commanding presence in ways that no one else could anticipate. The stories of her deeds traveled beyond Black Hollow, inspiring other towns to reconsider the nature of power, control, and influence. She became a symbol of quiet authority, a reminder that intelligence, observation, and strategic action could outweigh fear and violence. Her impact resonated far beyond the streets she had walked, leaving a lasting impression on the frontier and the people who lived there. In the end, Black Hollow never forgot her. Her arrival, her presence, and her actions reshaped the town permanently. The memory of a woman who rode into town alone and changed everything without confrontation became a legend. A story told quietly around fires and in taverns, reminding everyone that true authority could be subtle, precise, and undeniable. And so, the town moved forward, wiser, more aware, and better prepared for challenges, all because of a quiet rider who had arrived without fanfare, acted without aggression, and left a legacy that would endure long after her shadow had disappeared into the horizon.